This is the first in a planned three-part lecture series on the Battle of Okinawa, the last battle before the atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the end of the war. But first, a quick review of the war up to this point. This map depicts the extent of the Japanese conquest up to August 1942. By June of 1942, the eastern expansion of the perimeter had been halted after the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway. By August that year, the Japanese perimeter extended south into the Lower Solomons with their occupation of Guadalcanal and into New Guinea. In 1942, though stopped in the Central Pacific at Midway, the Japanese still threatened the last American stronghold in the South Pacific, Australia. Using land-based planes, ships, and supplies now flowing to Australia, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz decided to forestall the menace to Australia by seizing New Guinea's northeast coast and Guadalcanal in the Lower Solomons. Both campaigns were successful, with Guadalcanal's capture setting the pattern for a long road back for the United States, a succession of island-hopping operations moving ever east and north toward the Japanese home islands. Here is a map of the Pacific Theater as of August 1944. It indicates the extent to which the Japanese perimeter has been pushed back following successive victories at Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Tarawa, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. In this map, the white areas represent Japanese-occupied territory and the rust area as Allied areas of reconquest. Admiral Nimitz and the Central Pacific advance began in the Gilberts at Tarawa and continued through the Marshalls. By August 1944, the Marianas had fallen. In the Southwest Pacific Theater, General MacArthur advanced along the northeast coast of New Guinea and was poised to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines. This was the strategic situation in the Pacific in October 1944. General MacArthur had invaded the Philippines at Leyte and was poised to invade Luzon. The Japanese were in retreat and had been bypassed at Wake, Truk, and Rabaul. The Japanese were wholly dependent on the oil reserves from the Dutch East Indies to fuel their war effort, but this line of communication was vulnerable to attack. As the war continued to go against Japan, the U.S. Navy drew closer to this hitherto inviolable region of Japanese control. If the Navy could sever this line of communication, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt. This is a propaganda leaflet produced by the U.S. Office of War Information, depicting Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur choking off the sea route that carried oil from the East Indies to the Japanese home islands. Millions of these propaganda leaflets were scattered across Japan and Japanese-occupied territory in 1944 and 1945. At this stage of the war, the primary strategic goal was to secure a sizable landmass astride the focal point of Japan's southward sea lanes of communication. This triangular area bounded by Luzon, Formosa, and the China coast. Because the Japanese had forestalled a China coast landing by driving Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army into the interior, either Luzon or Formosa, it was a toss-up, became the strategic choice. Predictably, General MacArthur favored Luzon. Admiral Ernest King, the Navy's chief of naval operation, believed Formosa to be the wiser choice. President Roosevelt and Admiral Nimitz inclined toward Luzon. Admiral King was the last holdout for Formosa. As the strategic deadlock continued, in their planning for the end of the war, General Arnold, General Marshall, Admiral Leahy, and Admiral King, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, settled all but the final Formosa-Luzon choice. They agreed that Nimitz would take Yap, Ulithi, and two of the Palau Islands, while MacArthur took Morotai and an airfield site on Mindanao. Then both would invade Leyte in the central Philippines, where the Japanese had only a single infantry division. In early September 1944, Admiral Halsey upset this sequence in a favorable manner. He discovered that resistance to carrier strikes against Japanese airfields in the Philippines was less than anticipated. Halsey recommended that the Yap, Palau, and Morotai operations be cancelled and the Leyte operation advanced a full 2 months. The Joint Chiefs approved this plan in part. They moved the Leyte operation from December to October, but retained the Palau and Morotai operations. Morotai proved easy. The Japanese were not present in large numbers. Peleliu was another matter. The 1st Marine Division and later the 81st Infantry Division fought a tough, bloody battle in a foretaste of more to come, and which was not over until the end of November. Angaur fell easily and also furnished an airfield. Ulithi Atoll proved the most useful prize. Its large protected anchorage served for the remainder of the war as the major advanced base for the fast carrier forces of the Pacific Fleet. It was taken without a shot being fired, it being undefended. In this map, each circle represents one berthing anchorage. This photo with the fleet lying at anchor gives an idea of the size of the protected lagoon. It also served as a place for R&R. MacArthur began to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines by invading Leyte on October 20th, 1944. Their hand forced, the Japanese acted out of desperation. Admiral Toyoda, the Japanese naval commander, decided to use his powerful force of battleships to destroy MacArthur's transports. The end result of this titanic battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the destruction of most of the Japanese surface forces, including the giant battleship Musashi. They failed to reach MacArthur's landing forces, and those that survived the battle were forced to retreat. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese kamikaze made its first appearance in the war to strike terror in the U.S. Navy. On land, MacArthur's forces won a bitter 6-month campaign to subdue the islands. With Leyte's conquest, the Pacific War entered its final stages. United States military planners and naval leaders now faced the decision of where to go next. Even before MacArthur's invasion of Leyte began, Admiral King flew to San Francisco for a meeting at the St. Francis Hotel to settle the question about Pacific strategy to end the war. There he met Admiral Nimitz, who brought with him 2 of his generals, Simon B. Buckner, commanding the ground forces in the Central Pacific, and Millard Harmon, commanding the air forces. From nearby Monterey came Admiral Raymond Spruance, the alternate commander of the Pacific Fleet, to William Halsey. The St. Francis Hotel was one of the swankiest hotels in San Francisco. A private elevator took Admiral King to the top floor to the owner's suite, which had been on loan to the U.S. Navy for the duration of the war. In plush surroundings, the top Pacific commanders met to discuss strategy. The unspoken purpose of the conference was to sell Admiral King, and consequently the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on a strategy Admiral Nimitz had devised to press the war to its conclusion. If Nimitz could persuade King to accept MacArthur's strategy of invading Luzon instead of Formosa, everybody would be relieved. This would be no easy task. Nimitz tactfully presented King with a carefully drawn memorandum which demonstrated in precise terms, backed by statistical evidence, why an attack on Formosa was impossible in the near future. Insufficient combat and service troops were on hand in the Pacific and in the United States to support a Formosa invasion. Generals Buckner and Harmon backed him up on this. General Buckner pointed out that U.S. losses in a Formosa invasion might run to 150,000 or more. Nimitz offered a realistic alternative to the Formosa plan. Let MacArthur proceed with the liberation of Luzon and Manila. Use existing forces in the Central Pacific to seize Iwo Jima and Okinawa as a prelude to invading the Japanese home islands. This would utterly cut Japan off from her oil supply sources in the occupied territories. King listened intently, examined Nimitz's documents, and raised hard, incisive questions. He pointed out to Nimitz that even the Joint Chiefs questioned the feasibility of the Formosa invasion, but he challenged the idea of landing on Iwo Jima, only 700 miles from Japan. King then turned to his old friend, Raymond Spruance. "Haven't you something to say? I understand that Okinawa is your baby." The taciturn Spruance, never one to grab the limelight or to risk upsetting apple carts, merely mumbled that Nimitz had summarized matters so well that he had nothing to add. In the end, King graciously agreed to set aside Formosa for Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. King may have been influenced in his decision most strongly by a final advantage in Nimitz's plan. It would not alter the politically sensitive command structure in the Pacific Theater. It delayed the painful dilemma of choosing between Nimitz and MacArthur for the post of Supreme Allied Commander. Both would serve as co-equals. As Central Pacific Commander, Nimitz would handle the Iwo Jima and Okinawa operations. As Southwest Pacific Commander, MacArthur would deal with Leyte, Luzon, and the rest of the Philippines. Selection of a Supreme Commander could wait the invasion of the Japanese mainland or an earlier surrender of Japan. Okinawa lies at the midpoint of the Ryukyu Island chain south of Kyushu. Although to the Japanese, Okinawa was part of the homeland, being a regular prefecture, Tokyo's actual treatment kept the island little better than a colony, and a neglected one at that. Naha, its capital, lies at 26.2 degrees north latitude and 127.7 degrees east longitude. The little island of Ieshima lies 3 miles off the northwest coast of Okinawa. The Kurama Islands, a small group of islands, lie 8 miles west of Naha. There were several airfields scattered across the island, but the two most important ones, Yantan and Kadena, were just back from the beaches at Hagushi, the planned invasion beaches. There was an important airfield at Ieshima. The northern two-thirds of the island is more mountainous than the southern third. Reefs surround most of the island. Prior to mid-1944, Okinawa and the other islands in the Ryukyus were considered rear areas. It was not a high priority within the Japanese General Staff. Men and supplies therefore sailed to Okinawa in leisurely fashion. It was not until the spring of 1944 that Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo finally decided to arm the Ryukyus effectively by dispatching the 32nd Army to Okinawa. But then unexpected disaster struck. Japan's main defensive perimeter had been breached at Saipan in the Marianas. Okinawa would not be a rear area after all. Especially in civilian and naval circles, perceptive Japanese now lost faith in eventual victory. Always a dove, Japanese ex-premier Prince Fumimaro Konoe later observed, "After Saipan, it became even clearer to me that a successful termination of the war was impossible." Japanese Army firebrands vehemently disagreed. In the Army's estimation, they merely had to reinforce the most likely points of the expected American attack, confident that the spiritual strength of the Japanese soldier, his willingness to die in battle, somehow would prevail. A leisurely buildup of Okinawa was now out. Lying northwest, 1,112 miles from Saipan, Okinawa was an obvious target. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima was placed in command of the 32nd Army. Ushijima exemplified the best in samurai virtues. Early in the war, Ushijima had been an infantry unit commander in the successful campaign in Burma. He was highly regarded in the Imperial Japanese Army. To support Ushijima, Imperial headquarters assembled a young staff junior in age and rank. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho became Chief of Staff. General Cho enjoyed a fiery reputation as a young Turk. He was the antithesis of Ushijima. Deceptively scholarly looking with owlish eyes, he was stern of manner, burly of build, and explosive in disposition. A stranger neither to war nor to staff work, Cho could be expected to bully younger staff. He led by fear and intimidation. In September 1939, while still a captain, Cho had joined a secret clique of Army officers, the Cherry Society, or Sakurakai, whose members pledged themselves to purge Japan of all decadent influences which, as they saw it, were sapping ancient virtues. Anti-Western, anti-democratic, and anti-capitalist, the Cherry Society's 100-odd members sought to establish a military dictatorship. In the 1930s, Cho was involved in two conspiracies to kill high-ranking political leaders, including the Prime Minister, and to install a leading general as dictator. Despite this unstable background, he was selected over many other senior officers for assignment to the 32nd Army. The High Command probably hoped he would bring to the Army the same zeal and abandon he had so often exhibited in the past. If ardor could offset superior American firepower and save Okinawa, then General Cho could be expected to supply it. More important to Japanese 32nd Army fortunes on Okinawa than Ushijima was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. It was he who established the 32nd Army's troop disposition as its chief planning officer. Yahara had attended the Japanese War College, class of 1923. He then spent 10 months at Fort Moultrie in the United States as an exchange officer and served as a staff officer in successful campaigns in China, Thailand, Malaya, and Burma. Unlike Ushijima and Cho, Yahara survived the war and published his accounts of the battle. Tall for a Japanese, alert appearing and poised, Yahara truly looked the intellectual. Distinctly more Western in outlook than the traditionally minded Ushijima, he was almost the antithesis of Cho. Where Cho was impulsive, Yahara was deliberate. Where Cho was almost mystically aggressive in the samurai manner, Yahara was almost maddeningly rational. To him, war was primarily a science, only secondarily an exercise of will and abandon in the attack. The blending of these three personalities was more than an interesting coincidence. It made the 32nd Army's leadership extremely effective, perhaps the best of any Japanese garrison in the Pacific theater of war. It ensured that neither excessive zeal nor excessive caution would govern the Army's operation nor its disposal of troops to meet the forthcoming American attack. As chief planning officer of the Japanese 32nd Army, Colonel Yahara had to devise some way to prevent the United States forces from conquering Okinawa. He knew that the Americans needed its airfields, its harbor and anchorages, and its space for acres of tent cities, ration dumps, motor pools, and training maneuver areas to mount a successful invasion of the home islands. Colonel Yahara knew that they could not stop the Americans, that they would eventually take Okinawa. Instead, he envisioned waging a battle of attrition, bleeding the American forces and buying time to complete the defenses of the home islands. In a detailed analysis of the map of Okinawa, Yahara noted that almost everything the Americans needed lay in the southern third of Okinawa. Here was Naha, the only sizable port, and Nakakasuka Bay with its expanse of sheltered water. Here were Kadena and Yantan, the two best airfields, and enough reasonably level ground for massive base installations. Above the narrow waist of Okinawa, at the Ishikawa Isthmus, the island broadened into mountains and valleys too steep and precipitous to be useful. He proposed that this region be only lightly defended. The Americans would want Iwo Jima, lying just off the Matobu Peninsula, where the 32nd Army had 2 airstrips under construction. He could only spare a battalion for the defense of this little but important island. Where would the Americans land? Probably across the beaches north and south of the village of Hagushi. Having decided that the army must defend the south from attack probably across the Hagushi beaches, Yahara next had to consider how to do it. If he obeyed the instincts of the samurai, he would build strong delaying points at Hagushi at the water's edge, and then fling a reckless night counterattack from dug-in positions inland after the enemy had landed. But these tactics had failed repeatedly in the past. American superior firepower had always shattered beach defenses and littered the ground with dead Japanese when they began the fierce banzai charge. As drafted by Colonel Yahara, one of the first directives of the 32nd Army read, "Hand-to-hand combat with an enemy with superior firepower would be unsuccessful, especially at night." Yahara rejected defense on the beach and the banzai charge. Yahara knew that many 32nd Army officers would bitterly contest his determination to avoid counterattacks, most notably General Cho, the firebrand chief of staff to Iwo Jima, but Yahara's rationality and his understanding of the destructiveness of modern weapons overruled his sentiments and dictated his conclusions. Yahara and Cho would be at odds over tactics throughout the battle. In the end, circumstances and outcomes would prove Yahara right. What the 32nd Army should do, Yahara decided, was to conduct a purely static defense from high ground. With 3 full divisions and the reconstituted 44th Brigade after its loss at sea in June 1944, the Army barely had enough troops to man an unbroken perimeter in the south of the island. This perimeter would not defend a hollow shell, rather it would form the outer ring of defense in depth extending in concentric arcs to a central headquarters located under ancient Shuri Castle. Here is a modern reproduction of the ancient Shuri Castle. It is a nice tourist attraction and we always visit it on our Okinawa tours. It suffered a devastating fire on October 31, 2019, which virtually destroyed it. This is an aerial view of the castle compound with the ancient walls surrounding it. Iwo Jima's command post was under the castle during the Battle of Okinawa. Shuri represented the main Japanese defensive line. The castle lay on the high ground overlooking Naha. Beneath the castle, an ancient cave system could be extended to provide a completely safe bomb and shell-proof headquarters for Iwo Jima and his staff. Heavy guns in place nearby could shell any part of southern Okinawa. As Americans with heavy losses gradually penetrated the outer perimeter of the Shuri defenses, the Japanese troops could retire toward the center. As long as Shuri held, American shipping could not use Naha, and Okinawa could not become a staging area for invading Japan. Okinawa's soft coral and limestone rock facilitated Yahara's plan. The caves could be expanded with pick and shovel. They could enlarge natural caves into shelters for hundreds of men. The 32nd Army must dig so deep underground, Yahara's orders stressed, that even American battleship's 16-inch naval shells could not reach it. Moreover, it must fight from underground, emerging as infrequently as possible. Only thus could American firepower be nullified. Iwo Jima was also a worry to Yahara. The airstrips on this little island off the northwest coast of the Matobu Peninsula were a great prize and would enable the Americans to install radar and fighter planes to counter air attacks from Kyushu. There was little Yahara could do. He dispatched only a battalion to this little island and one to defend the Matobu Peninsula. They would not last long. On June 29, 1944, The submarine USS Sturgeon spotted a convoy transporting the Japanese 44th Independent Mixed Brigade in its periscope. The skipper, Lieutenant Commander C.L. Murphy, picked out the largest passenger cargo ship as his target, the 6,000-ton Toyama Maru, which was carrying all 6,000 men of the 44th Brigade. He fired a spread of 4 Mark 14 torpedoes from 3,200 yards. The wake from the torpedoes betrayed him. A seaplane dove on him and 2 trawlers 1,000 yards distant turned on the submarine. Murphy ordered an emergency dive and prepared for depth charges. 2 minutes later, at 0727, all 4 torpedoes hit the transport and detonated, tearing large holes in the side and on the bottom of the ship. It was immediately engulfed in flames along her length. She sank at once, carrying down with her 5,600 of the 6,000 soldiers of the 44th Brigade. Just 1 minute after the torpedoes exploded, the first depth charge rocked the Sturgeon. For the next hour, the Sturgeon was subjected to 70 depth charges. She was shaken, but otherwise only suffered minor damage. Single-handedly, Murphy and his crew had disrupted Okinawa's buildup of troops. To replace this terrible loss, the Imperial General Headquarters rushed the 15th Independent Infantry to Okinawa by plane, and the 9th Infantry Division, the 24th Infantry Division, and the 62nd Infantry Division to Okinawa by ship, which arrived without incident. On November 1, 1944, General Ushijima was informed by Tokyo that the 9th Infantry Division was ordered to be released from Okinawa and sent to the Philippines by way of Formosa. Ushijima and Yahara naturally raised objections to this move, but were overruled by Tokyo. Yahara replied that the 32nd Army could therefore not be responsible for the effective defense of Okinawa. Many places besides Okinawa desperately needed troops. In early December, the 9th Division sailed away. It was not replaced. This was the final disposition of Japanese forces to defend Okinawa. They were surrounded by Task Force 58 and cut off. There would be no reinforcements or resupply. At the same time Yahara was completing his plan for Okinawa's defense, American planning for the attack began. On October 3, 1944, the Joint Chiefs issued a directive sketching the guidelines for future operations. General MacArthur would capture Luzon beginning on December 20, 1944. Then Admiral Nimitz would land first on Iwo Jima on January 20, 1945, and next on Okinawa on March 1, 1945. These invasion dates were tentative, subject to delay if the usual shipping shortages so dictated. A few days after the Joint Chiefs issued their directive to begin future operations in the Western Pacific, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Staff to Admiral Nimitz, began planning the Okinawa attack, codenamed Operation Iceberg. This is the command structure for Operation Iceberg. Admiral Spruance was in overall command of Iceberg. Admiral Spruance commanded the covering forces that included Task Force 58 and the British carrier force Task Force 57. Admiral Kelly Turner was in direct command of the amphibious forces. Admiral Turner had controlled virtually every major amphibious landing in the Pacific, starting with Guadalcanal in 1942. He was a difficult personality, but he could get things done, and no one in the world knew more about amphibious operations. The third of Nimitz's trio of top commanders was General Simon Bolivar Buckner, son of a Confederate hero. General Buckner would lead the troops of the 10th Army assigned to the attack. He had served in the Philippines during World War I and had been commandant at West Point. Prior to the Okinawa campaign, he had served in Hawaii and Alaska. After the invasion forces landed, General Buckner would take command of the assault forces, the 10th Army. Once the island was secure, the Army garrison force would move in under the command of General Wallace. The 10th Army was composed of two corps. The Army 24th Corps was under the command of General Hodge. General Geiger commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps of the Marine Corps. The 24th Corps was composed of two Army infantry divisions. General Arnold commanded the 7th Division. General Bradley commanded the 96th Infantry Division of the Army, the other division of the 24th Corps. The other corps of the 10th Army was the Marine 3rd Amphibious Corps. It was composed of two Marine infantry divisions. General de Valla commanded the 1st Marine Division. General Shepard commanded the 6th Marine Division. The 2nd Marine Division was not part of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. It was to take part in a demonstration landing on the southeast coast of Okinawa, a feint that it was hoped would fool the Japanese into moving troops away from the intended landing beaches. It was commanded by General Watson. Not part of either the 24th Corps or the 3rd Amphibious Corps was General Greiner's 27th Infantry Division of the Army. It was designated as the floating reserve of the 10th Army. If all went according to plan, it would occupy the island after its seizure as the Okinawa garrison force. It would be needed as reinforcements well before the island was declared secure. The Army's 77th Infantry Division would assault the Kurama Islands prior to the invasion of Okinawa to secure the islands for Admiral Turner's advanced naval base. The 77th Infantry Division would later take Iwo. Here is a photo of the top commanders of Operation Iceberg on Okinawa. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Ocean area, is in the center. On the left is Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding all naval forces in Iceberg, and on the right, General Simon Buckner, commanding the 10th Army Ground Attack Forces. The total strength of the 10th Army's 7 infantry divisions came to 154,000, substantially more than Ueshijima's total force of approximately 105,000. This was the strategic situation in the Pacific on the eve of battle. United States Marines had completed the Iwo Jima operation on March 26th after a bloodletting that strained credulity. From bases in the Marianas, B-29s made daily strikes against the Japanese home islands. Kamikaze bases were hit on Kyushu. Okinawa was also hit to soften up Japanese defenses in preparation for Operation Iceberg, now scheduled for April 1st. American estimates of Japanese strength and disposition were moderately accurate and erred on the low side. Estimates were revised over the months prior to the landings as the Japanese 9th Division was withdrawn and small numbers of reinforcements arrived on supply ships. By March 1945, it was estimated that 75,000 troops were on the island. The American planners correctly guessed that the Japanese were concentrated on the southern third of the island and preparing a defense in depth. They also correctly estimated that a small screening force defended the northern part of the island. The Americans agreed with the Japanese that this disposition was more effective than a water's edge defense. They did, however, contemplate more resistance on the beaches than Ueshijima had prepared and expected upwards of 85% casualties among the assault troops. The early stages of the invasion called for the capture of the Kurama Islands 15 miles west of Naha by the 77th Infantry Division about a week before the main landings. The roadstead in the Kuramas would provide an ideal anchorage for refueling, rearming, and repairing ships of the bombardment line. A final preliminary operation consisted of the occupation of the Kiisa Islands, a group of 4 small, low islets between 6 and 8 miles off Naha. General Buckner wanted to emplace 24 155 mm howitzers on these islands to support the main landings. Opposition to the landings was negligible, and by March 31st, L-Day-1, the guns were ready to fire. The main landings by the 10th Army would begin at 0830 on April 1st, L-Day, or Love Day, which also happened to be Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day. The largest simultaneous amphibious assault in the Pacific War would consist of 2 Marine and 2 Army divisions landing abreast on an 8-mile stretch of the beaches north and south of Hagushi. The 6th Marine Division would land on the northern end of the beaches. The 1st Marine Division would land next to them to the south. The 96th Division would land on the southern end of the beaches. The 7th Division would land next to them to the north. The 2nd Marine Division would conduct a demonstration off the beaches at Minatoga with the hope that the Japanese would rush reinforcements to the south and tie down counterattack forces that could be used against the real landings at Hagushi. The Japanese apparently bought the ruse because they reported to Tokyo that they had repelled a landing at Minatoga. After conducting the demonstration, the 2nd Marine Division would remain as the 10th Army Floating Reserve along with the 27th Infantry Division as the Expeditionary Floating Reserve. The 81st Infantry Division was held in New Caledonia as the Area Floating Reserve. The Bishi Stream served as the initial physical boundary between the 3rd Amphibious Corps and the 24th Corps. The 3rd Amphibious Corps would land opposite Yontan Airfield with the 6th Marine Division on the left. The division would move rapidly inland, seize the airfield, and protect the 10th Army's northern flank by severing the island at the narrow Ishikawa Isthmus. The 1st Marine Division would land south of the airfield and maintain contact with the 24th Corps on its right. After securing the Yontan Airfield, the 6th Marine Division would advance across the island, severing it in two, cutting the north off from the south. The 1st Marine Division would advance to the east coast and down into the Kachin Peninsula. The 7th Division of the 24th Corps would land on the Corps' left, maintain contact with the 3rd Amphibious Corps, and seize Kadena Airfield. The 96th Division would land south of the airfield. The Corps' main mission, after capturing Kadena, was to swing south and secure an east-west line through the coastal town of Kuba and seal off the Japanese in the south. Once the island was severed and the Japanese forces divided and isolated, the central portion of the island secured, and the logistical buildup underway, the 24th Corps would advance south with the 7th Division on the east side and the 96th Division on the west to seize the main objective, the southern third of the island. The 3rd Amphibious Corps would back up the 24th Corps, securing the occupied sector across the island with the 1st Marine Division. The 6th Marine Division would advance north to clear out the northern part of the island. The 77th Infantry Division would seize Ieshima when ordered. The Floating Reserve, the 27th Infantry Division, would land as necessary as the 24th Corps' front line lengthened as the advance pressed south to where the island widened. The Navy task forces would transport and deliver the landing forces and sustain them ashore. They would remain on station to provide air cover and close air support and deliver naval gunfire support as needed. Fast Carrier Task Forces, U.S. Task Force 58, and the British Carrier Force, Task Force 57, would attack Japanese air bases in the home islands, on Formosa, and in the Ryukyus. Over 1,300 ships were committed to Iceberg. Admiral Spruance, in overall command of Iceberg, had his flag aboard USS Indianapolis. Following the landings, the projected perimeter was expected to reach to the east coast by L+15. This was the American plan. I will continue this lecture in Part 2 of Okinawa, the Last Battle.